We are now at the centenary of the end of the Civil War, and the ending of the Civil War was a very fragile thing. It nearly broke down several times in the immediate weeks and months after the original Dump Arms command, and even in the years afterwards it nearly broke down again. We nearly had a Civil War Part 2 and Part 3.
And for some reason, historians haven't really been interested in that. I tried to go into it in some detail in the book on County Louth, and I was asked, could I tone it down a bit? It was a bit complicated. It's not complicated, but it just makes that the history is much more interesting than what we're told, you know. So this is what I'll be telling you about, I hope, if everything works. Before, as you know, the Civil War, the generally accepted thing is that the Civil War broke out when the National Army attacked the anti-treaty forces in the forecourts at the end of June 1922. That didn't happen out of the blue. The Republican side had split terribly in January 1922 because of the treaty. Those who were in favor, those who weren't against. And we'll be going to that slightly. But there's two sides. There's the political side and then there's the army, the IRA. They each adopted a slightly different approach towards the Civil War, independent approach towards the treaty. And Sinn Féin split more or less in March 1922 over acceptance of the treaty, and this sort of magnificent, monumental force that had been in Irish politics since 1917 fell apart, and it was vicious, and people were at each other's throats. So they were due to have an election as it turned out, in June 1922, and they knew if the pro and anti Sinn Féin people were at each other, that it would get dirty. So what between Collins and De Valera, that they agreed a pact that they would that Sinn Féin would run as one panel, and that voters could vote in their own constituency according to how they felt, and that the cabinet positions would be allocated proportionate to how the vote was allocated in the vote. So if 2/3 of the electorate voted anti-treaty, then 2/3 of the seats in the cabinet would go to the anti-treaty side. This pact caused an outrage in Westminster. Winston Churchill threatened to reignite the Anglo-Irish conflict because of it. Because under this pact, you were going to have people who disagreed with the treaty, who would refuse to take the oath of allegiance. You would have them in ministerial positions in the government. This was completely unacceptable to the British government. And I have to say, the provisional government, the provisional Irish government, wasn't all that keen about it either, but it didn't get put in effect. That's the bottom line. But this was an attempt to stop the inevitable decline and collapse of the political end of the treaty debate. On the military front, that's Richard Mulcahy, who alternated between Chief of Staff of the Irish Army, Minister for Defence, and at one stage he was both. So the army split, and the more I think even now about what the army position was, the more complicated it gets, and the implications were just horrendous. Like the political end of it, the army split pro and anti treaty, and the provisional government that was established in January 1922, made up of pro-treaty people. The British government, the British Army was evacuating. So someone had to go in and take over the barracks, take over the premises. And so naturally enough, the provisional government wanted their supporters in to take over the barracks, but they didn't have anyone to do it. So they had to establish their own army. So from January 1923, that's wrong, no, 22. From January 1922, the provisional government started to recruit their own army. And mostly there would have been some pro-treaty IRA. The IRA generally was anti-treaty, but there was some pro-treaty, and this is where it gets complicated. The anti-treaty IRA held a conference. They were pushing Mulcahy that they wanted to have a conference to discuss the treaty. Mulcahy kept putting them off, and they started pushing Mulcahy in January 1922. Mulcahy kept putting them off until March 1922, and they decided they were going to go ahead with the conference. Mulcahy declared the conference illegal. So anyone who attended it was breaking the law. But what happened was, on foot of this conference, the anti-treaty IRA set up their own command structure, and they call themselves the executive, or the executive forces. So the anti-treaty IRA started taking their orders from this IRA executive from March 1922. Pro-treaty IRA continued to take orders from Mulcahy and the Dáil. They were called Dáil troops, pro-treaty troops. They had all sorts of names, some of them not so polite. But and where it gets complicated, you see, and this is something I only realized recently. Say, for instance, here in Dundalk, we had the 4th Northern Division under Frank Aiken. Frank he wasn't a big fan of the treaty, but he wanted to keep his men together because there was unfinished business in the north, and he knew that any split down here was just going to be a distraction from what was going on in the north. And he also knew that if he needed the support and the materiel that only the government could provide. So he was happy enough, in inverted commas, to continue to take instructions and orders from Mulcahy. And officially at the time, and all over the place, when they refer to the 4th Northern, this is contemporaneous documents, they refer to the 4th Northern as government troops. And even to the extent when Hogan from Monaghan invaded Dundalk, and they took over the prison, the governor of the prison complained that if there was a doubt about Aiken's loyalty to the government, I should have been told. After all, I am the head of the prison here. I've been dealing with Aiken. Aiken provided guards for my prison. So the fact that Aiken was suddenly not regarded as loyal to the government was a shock, certainly to the governor of Dundalk Jail. So, but where it gets really sort of interesting was that when Aiken took over at the Army Barracks down here in April 1922, he moved a lot of his men down from Newry, South Armagh, and moved them in there. And there was a debate then about whether he would have the men formally enrolled in the Irish Army, this new Irish Army, as they call it. Would they be attested? Would they sign the dotted line? If they were attested, they would get paid, they would get uniforms, they would get food. And Aiken, in a conversation with one of the Quinn brothers, Pádraig Quinn, decided he would not get them attested because he wanted to have the flexibility to order them around and to organize the things as he saw right, and not to have the government, for them to have the right to come in and start ordering him about. He wanted to maintain this little private army, if you like, because he had every intention of going back north. So he didn't have them attested, and that was a deliberate decision. But that was to cause him problems later on. In June 1922, there was 200 or 300 troops down there in the army barrack. They hadn't been paid in 6 months, and there was a mutiny. And so when Hogan invaded Dundalk, there was a ready-made group of lads there just ready to open the gates for him, you know. So Aiken was undermined from within. Unlike, say, Monaghan, the 3rd Northern Division, led by, what's the 5th Northern, sorry. The 5th Northern was under Dan Hogan, were attested. They were uniformed, they were being paid every week. So when Hogan decided, for whatever reason, and that has never been really decided on, why did Hogan invade? Probably under the instructions of Donal Duffy, but he invaded Dundalk, and that launched Aiken into his anti-treaty career, if you like. Now, I'm trying to avoid giving the history of the Civil War itself, because that's not what we're talking about. But these were efforts, what the point here is that these were efforts to avoid a split, to avoid a civil war. There was unification talks in June 1922 between both sides of the IRA, about that the new army and the IRA would be united. They even offered the position of Chief of Staff to Liam Lynch, who subsequently was subsequently become Chief of Staff of the anti-treaty IRA. And this is the photograph taken at one of these meetings. So Sean McKeown from the left, Sean Moylan, anti-treaty, Donal Duffy, pro, Liam Lynch, Garrett O'Sullivan pro, and Liam Mellows anti. 2 of those guys would be dead within 6 months, Liam Lynch and Liam Mellows. But that's the kind of the tragedy of it. You know, this is early June 1922, just on the edge of when the Civil War started. And they were talking, there was sincere efforts being made by people on both sides to avoid the war, and it's like something had taken over, and like lemmings rushing towards the edge. 14th of June, there was the election pact that I mentioned, and again in the history books it says Collins repudiated the pact 2 days before the election, and the IRA executive on the same day repudiated the army unity proposals. On the 15th of June, what's not so commonly referred to, but Collins actually supported the pact that he supposedly repudiated the day before. Again, it's the common narrative that Collins repudiated the pact. Well, the day after he didn't. You know, there's a lot of inconsistencies going on. On the 16th of June, the Free State Constitution was published. This was a very important document. People were hoping that this would be a Republican document. The British government wasn't having it, and it was a disappointment. The oath was there. The appeals to the Privy Council was there. Everything that the Republicans hoped wouldn't be there, the government was forced to put them back in by the British government. Anyway, there was a general election, and the pro-treaty Sinn Féin got 240,000 votes and 58 seats. Anti-treaty Sinn Féin got 134,000 votes and 36 seats. And others, farmers' parties, independents, so on, got 247 votes and 34 seats. So there was 487,000 votes cast, 92 seats to work the treaty, and 134,000 votes, 36 seats against. So something in the region of about 3-1, 2.5, 3-1 of the voting population voted in favor of the treaty or for parties who were prepared to work the treaty. That was the democratic mandate. Now, there's all sorts of arguments that the voting list was out of date and everything, which it was, but they didn't have time to get it up to date. But this was the election in June 1922, just days before the Civil War broke out. On the 18th of June, there was another IRA convention. Again, emphasizing the fact about all of these efforts to avoid the Civil War. And if the IRA convention rejected the Army unity proposals. And then out of the blue, Tom Barry stood up and he made a proposal that the IRA should attack what remained of the British forces in Ireland. The idea behind that was the British would retaliate, and the IRA and the Irish Army would unite against the common enemy, you know. So the initial vote was in favor, and then there was a dispute over the telling, over the counting, and so they voted again, and the vote was lost. And then there was a split. So the anti-treaty IRA split again, and Lynch, who was in the majority, who were against this proposed Tom Barry's proposal, they set up headquarters across the river from the forecourts in the Clarence Hotel. Again, it's not a thing that's emphasized enough, it's just how divided the anti-treaty IRA was. 22nd of June, Field Marshal Henry Wilson was shot dead in London. 26th of June, an initial decision by the British government to attack the forecourts was rescinded. General Macready's, who was the officer in charge of the remaining British Army here, said, "You must be crazy, don't do it." So he talked the British government out of it. On the 26th of June, another aspect that's never referred to is that IRA volunteers were arrested in Drogheda for enforcing, they were doing the Belfast boycott thing. They had attacked a train and taken Belfast goods out of it. On the same day, there was people at the same thing in Baggot Street in Dublin who were arrested as well, in retaliation for which the Forecourts garrison arrested Lieutenant General J.J. O'Connell and in retaliation, and they said he wouldn't be released until the boys in Drogheda were released and the fellas in Dublin were released as well. On the 27th of June, the Forecourts were attacked by the Irish Army. That was the start of the Civil War. But the point here is there was all these efforts made to avoid the Civil War beforehand. So the fighting was going on in Dublin. It lasted 4 or 5 days, and the next thing was to stop it spreading. And the key here was Limerick. If Limerick fell to either side, they would control the south and the west. It had almost broken out in March, and there was a deal done between Michael Brennan, who was the Free State Army commander down there, and Liam Lynch. And much to the disgust of Donal Duffy, basically they just stood back and said, and they were very polite and said, "Okay, you take that building, we'll take this building, da 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 da." And everyone was happy with that except for Duffy. And so the fighting, things were beginning to brew up again in Limerick. Frank Aiken was up here, and he could see it, as everyone could see, that if the fighting spread to Limerick, there was going to be all merry hell all over the country. Aiken took himself down to Limerick to try become part of people who were negotiating for peace. That didn't work out, and according to Aiken himself, whatever agreements were made, they were broken by the Free State Army side. He particularly picked out a chap called Michael Brennan for criticism. And that's Aiken there at around that time, probably 1922, with some heavy hitters. Behind him on his left shoulder is Michael O'Hanlon, sorry, yeah. And Rory O'Hanlon's father. John McCoy, then on that's Petey Boyle, just behind Aiken's right hand shoulder, and John Quinn on the bottom. And that's Fitzpatrick, is it, on the bottom with the dog? Yeah. These were guys you wouldn't want to necessarily meet, at 11 o'clock at night, So the Aiken's attempt again to avoid the spread of the Civil War, he amongst others didn't succeed. Limerick was fought over, and Limerick was lost by the IRA, by the anti-treaty people. This is a very important letter from the local perspective here. Aiken's peace efforts, and they were reflected all over the country by different people. But this is a letter dated the 28th of August, is it? 26th of August, 1922. This is 4 days after Collins was killed, and the country was in trauma. And it's a letter to Joseph Dolan, who was a businessman and a nationalist in RD, who had obviously written to Mulcahy. We haven't got his letter, but this is Mulcahy's response to whatever whatever Dolan said to him. And the important bits that I said, nobody appreciates Frank Aiken's mind more clearly or more sympathetically than I do. Frank was not only negotiating with me for preserving peace in Dundalk, he was actually doing it. But he had very dangerous forces within his ranks, and Frank could not have controlled. That was his excuse for the Dundalk invasion and arresting Aiken and his men, their breakout and their subsequent retaking of Dundalk, and then the Irish army had to go back up and take Dundalk again. There's a very interesting, we haven't got time, very interesting this exchange of letters between Aiken and Mulcahy on foot of Aiken's taking over Dundalk in August 1922. And first of all, he commiserates with Mulcahy over the death of Collins, and then he reports to him, cheekily enough, on his operation, which took over Dundalk. And but the letters is Dear Dick and Dear Frank. It's not Dear General or Dear Miss. It's Dear Dick and Dear Frank. And it shows a level of intimacy there that we don't maybe appreciate it enough. Now, peace moves. There were numerous attempts at peace moves, even while the fighting was still going on. In September, on the 6th of September, Mulcahy and De Valera met up secretly in a room in a house in Rathmines, I think it was, or somewhere around there. Mulcahy turned up because he was told by a priest that Dev had changed. He was a changed man. All this fighting had shocked him and all the rest. And he was a changed man. So unknown, it's alleged, to his fellow colleagues in government, Mulcahy went to this meeting with Dev. Apparently, the meeting lasted 2 minutes. They didn't even sit down. Mulcahy says it was quite obvious from the get-go that there was no meeting of mind here. Mulcahy's position was that peace could be attained on the basis of the treaty. Dev's case was peace could be attained on the basis of revising the treaty. Now, it's a Jesuitical difference to me, but this is what separated them. And Mulcahy maintained that the army must be subject to political control. De Valera fudged the issue and said that while he was an intelligent guy and all the rest, that he would humbly follow men of faith like Rory O'Connor. In other words, he was going to follow the militarists on this one at this stage. So after that 2-minute meeting, Mulcahy was convinced that that there was no negotiating with the anti-treaty people, and that military victory was only possible with military courts and executions. And this is where the policy of government executions was derived from. And the Emergency Powers Act was brought in at the beginning of October. So just a matter of a couple of weeks after that abortive meeting with Dev, the dreadful law, regulations and laws which allowed for executions was introduced. So there was other peace initiatives. I'll just go through them very quickly. There was a Cork clergyman tried to bring them all together. De Valera himself tried to meet with Lynch at the end of August to say that the war was unwinnable. These are all secret. These weren't publicized. And Western National Army officers made proposals in September. October 1922, when the government brought in the executions bill, for want of a better word, they also offered an amnesty if anyone wanted to hand up their arms and quietly go home. There was further unification proposals from the Western IRA in November 1922. And then we go on to 1923, and these are the two important ones. Liam Deasy in January 1923 and the neutral IRA in January to March 1923. Liam Deasy on the left-hand side was part of this first Southern, he was the deputy chief of staff of the anti-treaty IRA, hugely respected, and an extraordinarily brave man. He was convinced by the end of 1922 that the war was unwinnable from the anti-treaty side. And he had proposals that he was going to take to DC, to Liam Lynch, to end the fighting. He was arrested by the Free State Army, and as in accordance with the law at the time, he was arrested on the 18th of January. He was tried on the 25th of January. He was found guilty, and he was informed on the 26th of January that he was to be executed on the following day. Now, hours before that sentence was due to be carried out, orders came from Mulcahy that Deasy should be removed to Dublin. And in Dublin, he was offered his life if he would make an appeal to his fellow anti-treatyites to give up their arms and to surrender their arms and make peace. And he sent, and he thought about it. I mean, it must have been horrific from his point of view. If he didn't do this, he's going to be shot, going to be executed. He was a brave man. We've no idea what kind of hell that he went through when he thought about this. In the end, he did write a letter to the other members of the IRA executive, and asking them, he asked them for the immediate and unconditional surrender on the part of all those associated with them, together with their arms and equipment. This appeal to the IRA executive was made public on the 9th of February, and the government announced another moratorium, if like, on executions. And they ratcheted up the pressure. They put advertisements in newspapers appealing to people to give up their arms. The effect on this on the anti-treaty was huge. Deasy, like I said, was a highly respected guy, and while no one, it is known, accepted his appeal, if you like, as Tom Barry said, it put the tin hat on the anti-treaty side. Deasy himself wasn't executed. He spent another 12 months in jail. He was pushed to one side, if you like, by the IRA. A year afterwards, he was threatened, and he was told that he was going to be court-martialed by the IRA for treason. And Tom Barry, it was, said that he would defend him, and if anyone touched a hair on Deasy's head, that they would have Tom Barry to deal with. So that was enough. He got a fair trial, and he was dismissed with ignominy from the IRA. No one's going to take on Tom Barry if they're sensible, you know. But that was Deasy. But pressure was growing from within the Republican movement. 600 Republican prisoners in Limerick and 100 in Clonmel issued an appeal for peace. And this is February now, 1923. And the same day, De Valera prepared circulated a proclamation to the people of Ireland outlining principles for peace. Okay, that's Deasy. That's Deasy there. And that's Liam Lynch. So the neutral IRA then suddenly came out of nowhere, if like, at the end of 1922, beginning of 1923. And they were made up of, by and large, probably anti-treaty IRA elements who refused to take part in any shooting of fellow Irishmen. And one of the guys actually who was prominent in it was Donal Hall, who was the guy who led the Dundalk volunteers out of here in 1916, Galway man, I think, or a Limerick man. He escaped in 1916. He spent the 1921 period in IRA GHQ, very close associated with Michael Collins. So he was well got, you know. So the neutral IRA, this organization grew up out of nowhere, if you like. And they had a big meeting in Dublin. They proposed that Civil War armies should be demobilized with a new army of pre-truce IRA established. There should be a 1-month truce to allow this to go on, to allow the IRA executive get together to meet, and that all Republican military activities be suspended, and that all Free State arrests, trials, executions should also be suspended. Both the anti-treaty and the pro-treaty sides dismissed these proposals. And according to Todd Andrews, who was anti-treaty IRA, being the neutral IRA, they were despised by both sides. But they were important because they were for 3 months they held the story of trying to move towards a peaceful settlement. So the thing about these proposals and attempts for peace is that they all came from outsiders, if you like. If there's going to be peace, it was going to come from within those who are doing the fighting. In February, De Valera issued his principles for peace, which were not universally accepted. Mary McSweeney, sister of Terence McSweeney, called them ruinous. The 20th of February, there was big pressure. The southern IRA, the southern divisions of the IRA knew that the game was up. That's where most of the fighting was going on. They knew that the game was up. They were putting big pressure on Liam Lynch. This has to be ended. And Tom Barry was in the middle of this sort of thing. You know, this cannot go on. Lynch was sort of a kind of detached from reality here. And after much pressure, they had a meeting. Tom Barry and the 1st Southern Division had a meeting with Liam Lynch, and what they wanted was that a meeting of the IRA executive would be called, and to make decisions about the furtherance of the war. They said that it was Barry and it was the Southern IRA's contention that the war could not be won. And at this stage, the IRA had 13,000 men in prison and 8,000 men active against 30,000 Free State Army. And put that into a local context, here in County Louth, there was approximately 24 active IRA men against 800 to 1,000 Free State Army. A year previously, there was 1,000 active IRA men, and there was 300 of the local IRA in jail or in prison. So the IRA was absolutely smashed all over the country, and this is what Barry and the Southern IRA were promoting. So they had a meeting. The IRA executive had a meeting on the 23rd of March, and Aiken proposed this motion that the government be empowered to enter into negotiations roughly on the basis of principles of 1, 2, and 3 of the President's memo dated 9/2/1923. It's a bit formulaic, but Aiken's proposal was that the government, which means De Valera, should go ahead on the basis of his principles and try and negotiate a peace. Now, where it falls down for me, he said, enter upon negotiation roughly on the basis of principles. I mean, that is a recipe for disaster. I mean, there was a whole big war about what the plenipotentiaries did and didn't do in December and 1921 when they were negotiating the treaty in London, whether they followed their instructions or not. To follow roughly on the basis of principles is, but anyway, there was 5 in favor, 5 against, and Lynch abstained. Tom Barry was much more direct, and he said the opinion of the executive, further armed resistance and operations against the Free State government will not further the cause of independence of this country. That's clear. Tom Barry just wanted a ceasefire. That was it. 5 in favor, 6 against. It was narrowly beaten. Lynch and Aiken both voted against this proposal. So they decided to adjourn that meeting and that they would come together again to further discuss. And when they did, the venue where the meeting was to be held was surrounded by Free State Army. And Lynch, they tried to break out. Most of them escaped, but Lynch was shot and killed. And Aiken wrote to Dev, you'll have seen that Liam was wounded and captured. All I can say is it was God's will. There were 6 of us under fire from 40 rifles and a machine gun for half an hour on a bare mountain, and only he got hit. We carried him a short bit, but he insisted on leaving him. It was damn hard to do, but there was nothing else to be done. I am acting for Chief of Staff until one is appointed. So that was Aiken reporting to Dev what had happened. This is the day after Lynch was killed, so the communications was pretty good. De Valera responded on the same day. In consequence of the death of the Chief of Staff, you will, of course, take over command with the title of Acting Chief of Staff until the vacancy is permanently filled. Now, I'm intrigued by this little short little thing. It could almost be taken as Dev is instructing Aiken, not confirming what Aiken wrote to him, but he's also giving the benediction and said, yes, he said, you will take over command because I said so. You will, and you will with the title of Acting Chief of Staff, because I'm giving you the imprimatur and until the vacancy is permanently filled. This wouldn't have bothered Aiken precisely because Aiken was heading that direction. He knew it was a political thing that had to resolve this. And he was huge in admiration of Dev anyway. But I think that's a fascinating little note that I think if there's a thing where the power shifted from the military side to the political side, this is it. That's what I think. They had a meeting anyway on the 20th of April. Aiken was appointed chief of staff, and they passed a motion here to make peace that the government, which meant Dev, and the Army Council, to make peace with the Free State government on the following basis: that the sovereignty of the Irish nation and the integrity of its territory are inalienable, that any incident reported to the contrary is, to the extent of the above principle, null and void. Now, again, you want to be a Jesuit, there's so many subclauses with that one, but it is some kind of movement forward. It is again, it's passing the torch over the political side. You go and negotiate under your principles, but if you go outside your principles, it's null and void. So if you're going to negotiate, everyone knows when you negotiate, there has to be some concessions. Otherwise, it's not negotiations. Anyway, that was passed 9-2. This was at the same meeting. This was another Tom Barry one. In view of the position of the Army, we direct the Government and Army Council to call off all armed resistance against the Free State government and Free State forces. No conditionality, no nothing. They said, call it hot, lads. We've done enough. That was defeated 9-2. And the final motion at that meeting was that we should carry on the war if the Free State government did not accept our peace terms. That was stalemated at 6 each. So there's a meeting then with the government, the Republican government, meaning Dev, and it was decided this is the 26th, 27th of April, and it was decided that Aiken would issue a suspension order, suspending all operations. De Valera would issue terms under which peace could be negotiated. And also, again, very, very significant, that they agreed that De Valera would take charge of any negotiations. The guy with the subtlest mind, the most able politician probably of the 20th century in Ireland, was back in control here now. And that he would summon a further meeting with the IRA executive if and when he considered necessary. I mean, they've given him carte blanche, and they knew what they were doing, or Aiken knew what he was doing. So this is the suspension order. This is suspension order on the 27th of April. This was suspension. This wasn't the dump arms. This was just suspension pending negotiations. And so what the things were, you'll arrange suspension of all offensive operations in your area from the 30th of April. All units will take adequate measures to protect themselves and their munitions. Now, that was by no means the end of it, because the following day, Aiken issued instructions to prepare for war. So the IRA were nervous. There's absolutely no doubt about it. They were nervous about this whole peace process thing. The following day to this suspension order, Aiken issued instructions to prepare to go back to war. In the meanwhile, Dev was going off to see if he could negotiate a peace. So I'm not going to go through this, but just these were De Valera's main principles: that the sovereign rights of the nation are indefeasible, all legitimate governmental authorities derived from the people, ultimate decision makers are the people, no one can be excluded by oath or other tests from participation in political or administrative bodies, freedom of expression or rights of citizens, military forces are the service of the nation. The Irish government, delighted to point back to Dev and the anti-treaty side, that most of these principles were already enshrined in law anyway. The problem that they had was that one about no one can be excluded by oath or other test from participation in political. That's the oath all over again. This is going right back to the arguments and the debates about the oath of allegiance to the king. And the government said, we're not revisiting that. Yeah, everything else is taken care of. That's not to fight over, but we're not going back to discuss the oath. And negotiations went on. There was government position that they would not agree to the abolition or the diminution of the oath. The Free State Army would continue, actions would continue while arms were held by the IRA. Surrender of arms, if the IRA wanted to surrender arms, it would be handed sensitively. Well, they did specify that that would include if it was handed to a local parish priest. You know, the Free State Army were not renowned for their sensitivity, so you have to worry about that one. And if there was a general election coming up, that the anti-treaty people would have a free field, if you like, provided that they conducted themselves in constitutional and peaceful methods, which is kind of reasonable, to be honest. So this was the first 2 weeks in May, and the IRA were panicking. On the 8th of May, they wrote to De Valera and they expressed anxiety at the lack of any meaningful progress, and worried about the detrimental effect this was having on their troops. And they warned that if the attitude of the Free State was as reported, then the sooner the suspension of activity was called off, the better. So they were panicking, and they were ready to go back to war. And they called for an immediate meeting with the Republican government in view of the possible bad effects that further delay would entail. Dev was very sanguine and wrote them back a placating letter. So I said, "We're doing fine, lads. We're okay. Don't panic." But yeah, Free State government called a halt to negotiations on the 9th of May. So they only lasted a couple of weeks. On the 9th of May, they called a halt, and all the correspondence was published in the record of the Dáil. So the Republican side were up a gum tree. They had called a halt, and they had not progressed. So there was another meeting with during this period, there was persistent rumors that the clandestine Free State negotiation with Tom Barry. Barry strenuously denied this, but it was persistent, and it was commonly held that Barry was negotiating secretly with the Free State. Barry himself denied it, and he wrote to De Valera expressing outrage that this rumor was going ahead. But it was commonly held, put it that way. So the De Valera and the IRA, then they had a final meeting on the 13th or 14th of May, and they issued a unilateral dump arms order. And that, if you accept the common thing, that was the end of it. That was the end of the Civil War. It was, but just about. Barry trying to get under his skin is very, very difficult. He proposed at one stage. Sometimes it said it's in April, sometimes it said it's in June of 1923. That there should be a final stand. The Republicans should make a final stand, take over some buildings in the centre of Dublin, replicating 1916 all over again, and hold out for 3 or 4 days. and because he was disgusted that the Republican IRA hadn't put up a good fight during the Civil War. He also proposed to Dev that the IRA should no longer be subject, if you like, or be associated with De Valera's government, Sinn Féin, or whatever you want to call them, because the De Valera's government could not negotiate away the Irish Republic as declared in 1919, whereas the army could. Now, I don't get the logic, but this is what he said to Dev. He was causing trouble. Aiken wrote to De Valera in this is mid-April. This is while Dev was negotiating with the Free State government. He says, TB, Tom Barry, is no fool. If he won't act up to his responsibilities as a member of the executive and won't behave as a disciplined soldier, he should go. Aiken had it in for Barry. Barry and DC didn't get on, and Barry was very dismissive of DC. And whereas Aiken was very loyal to DC, he disagreed with his tactics and all that, but he was very loyal to DC. On the 20th of there was a letter of the 20th of June, which is after the dump arms order, that Barry wrote to the Aiken. It hasn't surfaced as far I know. There was a bit of a hunger strike going on at the time. Barry said that he opposed the hunger strikes. According to Tom Crofts, who was on the IRA executive, the letter covered the surrender of arms and the surrender of men, that the idea was to fill up the jails so to be ungovernable, if you like. Aiken recalled that it was relating to the surrender of arms and that there was a plan to restart the war. So there's, Barry's idea to take over the centre of Dublin. Now he's planning to restart the war. Aiken resolved that this was a mutiny, and he had a meeting on the 11th of July. He had it organised that Barry had to resign from the IRA executive, and that was to come back 10 years later. But that's another night. That's another story. So, if Barry hadn't followed, the war would have reignited. Aiken ran for the Dáil. He was elected as TD in August 1923, and that was his notification. And you can see he's described there, Frank Aiken, Chief of Staff, IRA, Irish Republican Army. No baiting around the bush there. That's what he was described as, and he topped the poll in County Louth. I think about 6,500 votes. He had a surplus of about 700 votes, which went to Cathal O'Shannon, I believe. O'Shannon was a sitting TD. He failed to get re-elected. But during the election, the government leaked a letter which Aiken had sent to a comrade, talking about tactics and in the event of a future war. It was a letter from Aiken to Henry O'Malley, and he said that explosives, gas, fire, and trench mortars should be used in future conflict. Now, Dev said that was just two old soldiers talking about what should or should not happen. It's not exactly a peaceful letter. And 2 years later, as we can see, Aiken was actively looking for gas from the US. So the Irish government were actually correct in being very cautious about whether this peace, unilaterally declared by the IRA, was genuine, and it was genuinely going to hold. But it wasn't on one side. In County Monaghan, during the election campaign, the Free State Army beat and shot two Sinn Féin election workers near Ballybay. Aiken was elected on the first count in August 1923, and a hunger strike. Prisoners were still being held in jails and in prison camps, sometimes in appalling conditions. And they went on hunger strike in October 1923 after a particularly brutal period in Mountjoy. And at one stage, there were 6,000 or 7,000 men on a hunger strike. This was been led by the prisoners themselves. Aiken and the IRA executive were kind of playing catch up an awful lot of it, and encouraging them without discouraging them. But it collapsed after 3 or 4 weeks. 2 people died. Sorry, just incidentally, the returning officer there, J.J. Russell, he had his house burned during the incendiary campaign of early 1923. I just noticed that the other day. I thought, oh. The IRA continued to attack. In 1924, on the March 21st, a group of soldiers who were stationed at Cove were coming ashore, and they were machine gunned from that Rolls Royce. It's now in the National Museum, powerfully geared up with a machine gun in the back. Every home should have one, you know. There's that. The car itself was apparently burnt and buried, and was found about 10 years ago, and it was dug up, and it's been restored. That was the IRA. In 1920, in October 24, the Free State Army opened fire at the cemetery at the road here when they were reburying those who were executed. It's unbelievable. There was thousands of people there, and someone produced a gun to fire shots over the grave, and the Free State Army had the graveyard surrounded and opened up. Now, they said they were firing shots over the head. It was an unbelievable, stupid thing to do. My father was there that day. And by November 24, Moss Toomey, who was the adjutant, if you like, of the IRA, was complaining about the political direction. Aiken had definitely pursued the political road in the previous 12 months. And sort of in response to that, in April 25, the Sinn Féin had a bad local election, and the IRA had stood back to give Sinn Féin a free road. Sinn Féin didn't take advantage of it. And so in April, Aiken issued instructions to the IRA, north and south, that activities will be recommencing, and issued detailed instructions about how to deal with the various bodies, judicial and so on, in north and south of the border. So the thing there is that this truce, this dump arms thing that happened in 1923, it kind of was temporary, and everyone seemed to expect or even hope that some way or other something would start again. But Aiken had moved on. Aiken had saw that that war was not the way forward to produce what he wanted, which was an independent Irish republic. That didn't go well with with a lot in the IRA, and there was new bloods coming up, and so in November, Moss Toomey was pushing him to have an executive meeting, which Aiken resisted for 12 months. In the end, he had to have it, and November 20th, 1925, Aiken was deposed as chief of staff of the IRA. And there was hostility coming from his own backyard. One of the motions which condemned the political movement on the political emphasis within the IRA came from the 4th Northern Division area in County Louth. So Aiken was deposed, and he wrote a letter, a farewell letter, if you like, to the incoming executive, and given it to them with both barrels, and he reloaded several times, you know. But the gist of the letter, one of the important things of the letter was that he said, it's an absolute acceptable tactic to use the facilities and the legal setup in the Northern Ireland legislature and the Southern Irish legislature to pursue our aims, as long as we don't have to take that oath. Now, setting aside the oath for a moment, he was saying, let's go politics. You know, we have to use politics. It's an acceptable thing to do. You know, which that would have been most in the IRA would have completely disagreed with him. But that's where Aiken was at that stage. The next thing that happened really was after he was deposed of the IRA, he went to the United States. He was sick. He had contracted TB. He was very ill over there, and he was ostensibly over there collecting for the cause. What exact cause, I don't know. But while he was over there, Sinn Féin split, and Dev set up Fianna Fáil. And this was Aiken's response. So this is July 1926. He said, "I'm with Fianna Fáil." And this ad appeared in the Dundalk Democrat. So there was no if and button, anything else. And setting up a Fianna Fáil took away a lot of the activists. Setting up Fianna Fáil, in itself, what they did was they took over the old IRA organizations in those initial years. The captains and the lieutenants and the privates all became Fianna Fáil stalwarts, and with that energy. And they had a phenomenal organization in that first 10 years. You know, it was for this cause, getting rid of the pro-treaty getting rid the Clan Gaels, as they call themselves, had become too identified with the business class, and people were starving. There were no jobs, and there was no one speaking. And in fact, if you look at the Fianna Fáil manifestos for 1926 elections, 27 elections, it's all about economies and jobs and houses. There's a bit about the treaty, and there's a bit about we're not going to take that oath. But they were looking for votes from people who were looking for jobs, who were starving, and that's where their support came from. And they didn't win, but they did very well. They had to take the oath. That's another night's diversion, you know. And Fianna Fáil swallowed their pride, they swallowed everything else. They took the oath, and they went into the Dáil in 1927. And 1932, they were elected. They became part of a coalition government with Labour, and Frank Aiken was appointed Minister for Defence. The Chief of Staff of the IRA, 5 years later, was now Minister for Defence. And on St. Patrick's Day, 1932, there he was in College Green, saluting the Irish Army as they marched past, and the armoured cars marched past. And the far end of that line there is Sean Lemass, another IRA man who was chucked out of the IRA in 1924. He was voted off because he saw the end of the line. He wanted to get into politics. And the little man here is Michael Brennan, who Aiken had come up against in Limerick, 1922. and who Aiken had publicly eviscerated over his carry-on down in Limerick. But here he is, standing to attention behind his minister. And that encapsulates the peaceful, if you like, handover of power. 2 weeks or a couple of weeks before this, Aiken was up giving evidence. There was the Irish press was being prosecuted for, I don't know, something or other against the offence against the State Act, and he was giving evidence on behalf of the Irish press, and he was asked a question about he was asked what are your intentions in relation to violence and all the rest, and Aiken said there is a time where violence, where you have to fight, and there's a time where it's not necessary. When it was necessary to fight, I've fought. Now it's not necessary, and I'm into politics. Okay, that's fair enough. And I said, what about would you support the Irish Army? And Aiken said, I would support an Irish Army. The difference between the Irish Army and an Irish Army. And 2 weeks later, he was saluting the Irish Army, So that was, there he is. There's a movie tone of all this on YouTube, and it's quite good. 10 years separated these photographs. And I'm talking about Aiken, not just because Frank's here and I'm afraid of him, but it's because he symbolizes a lot. Looking at Aiken, you can understand a lot. It raises a lot of questions. 1922, he was Chief of Staff of the IRA, a reluctant participant in the Civil War. He did his best to stop the Civil War spreading. He did his best to that the Civil War would not take place here in this part of the country. He had his own reasons. One of those reasons was that he said the Civil War would split the IRA and attention would be diverted from the north of Ireland. And he was absolutely correct. It was, and it continued to be. And he was hunted, himself and Dev and all the other anti-treaty guys. They were hunted, they were jailed. They found politics, they went into politics, and 5 years later, they took over government and the sky didn't fall. And they proved to be just as competent, just as good as the Free State government in running the country. And they were in power until 1948. And what gets me is we've been talking here about the past few weeks about 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement. Aiken was in power 5 years after being Chief of Staff of the IRA. Things condense greatly, or maybe we just talk about things too much now that we don't make decisions. But the condensing of things that happened in 1920s and 1930s to me is unbelievable, And thank God we have the decade of commemorations over. I'm thoroughly fed up of it. But what happened in the 20s and 30s is actually potentially much more interesting. Because how did we here deal with independence? How did we deal the hungry 20s? People were starving. There was no jobs. You couldn't immigration if you were lucky, Then you had the rise of Fianna Fáil, you had the rise of the blue shirts, how that was dealt with, and then you had the outbreak of the Great War, of the Second World War. In that 18 years between 1922 and 1940, it's an awful lot of stuff going on. We're still talking about 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement. and we're still arguing about what could have been, what should have been, you know. So that's done. People should start looking now at how did we manage the peace? How do we manage independence? Just a couple of books. There's a couple of books. These are two books which I found just wonderful. Bill Kissane, it's published by Oxford Press. It's pushed on 30-something quid, but it's really good. It's an analysis of the politics of the whole thing. Michael Hopkinson's narrative of the Civil War takes some beating. They're very fair books. They're the plow. You know, where people are to be criticised, they criticise them. Two recent biographies. Again, now I've only just bought them, and I've skimmed through them, but I found them very good as well. And locally, we have these two books that Jean mentioned. That one, the one on the left, apparently now is only available on Amazon, if you don't mind. I should be worth a fortune, you know, but I'm not. And that one on the right is produced a couple of years ago. The problem about the Civil War period in County Louth, in any of the general books, Louth doesn't get a mention. You know, it'll only be a kind of mention that A. Aiken burst out of the jail, B. Aiken became chief of staff. All the other things don't get a mention. I had to squeeze in maybe about 10,000 words maybe in relation to the Civil War in that book. I have a manuscript at home of 100,000 words about what actually happened in County Louth during that period. You know, someday I'll get it out some way or another. It's a fascinating story. It just hasn't been told yet. That's it. Go home. I'm done. Thank you.